I'm Mark Golub, and in election 2016, the race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for the White House enters its final 2 months, and Secretary Clinton seems to have a substantial lead over Mr. Trump. Many people are claiming that this is the dirtiest presidential election they've ever seen. I can only say, I seem to remember hearing that charge every presidential election. We're also hearing that neither candidate is loved by even a majority in their own party. As the polls show, voters view Donald Trump as unfit to be president, while they seriously mistrust Hillary Clinton. And so we hear that perhaps most people will be going to the polls to vote for the candidate they dislike less. Again, this is not the first time I'm hearing that people are voting for the less objectionable of the two political candidates. Well, what's it all mean for the American Jewish community? For some insight, I'm so pleased to be joined once again by the Washington correspondent for the Jewish Forward, Nathan Guttman. Nathan, it's good to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So Nathan, you and I have discussed usually 70% and up of Jews vote for the Democratic candidate. Do you see any erosion in Jewish support for Hillary?
No, not right now. I guess the latest number that we have and that we can look at is a recent poll that was conducted in Florida, specifically with Jewish voters in Florida. And that found about 66% of Jewish voters saying that they will vote for Hillary Clinton, which is pretty much in line with the percentage that supported President Obama at this point of the race 4 years ago. So no, we don't see. I mean, and that's frankly the only credible number that we have right now, because as you know, it's pretty difficult to poll Jews, are a small part of the population. It's a very big investment to actually conduct election polls that target only Jewish voters. So this Florida poll is the only one we have right now, and that seems to indicate that no, there isn't any major shift. I think it's interesting to see that we still have a significant number of Jewish voters still supporting Donald Trump. We're talking about a quarter of the voters in Florida. And it's also interesting to see that these trends are opposite when you look at specifically at Orthodox Jewish voters who seem to support overwhelmingly Trump over Clinton. I believe that probably reflects the situation across the country, not only in Florida.
Very interesting. We'll get a little to Trump a little bit more in a moment. In some way, but I am very appreciative that you're willing to say on television, we don't really have good polls of Jewish voters. And some people try to, act as if we know everything. We know very little. It's also never really wise to make more general statements out of anecdotal experiences. At the same time, you talk all the time, Nathan, to Jewish leaders. Do any of the scandals surrounding Mrs. Clinton, the email scandal, the Clinton Foundation scandal, do any of them seem to resonate with Jewish leaders or Jewish voters in your experience?
No, frankly, I don't feel that they do, and for a few reasons. First of all, when we're talking about Jewish leaders, we're talking about the Jewish establishment. And the Jewish establishment, by and large, prefers a candidate such as Hillary Clinton. Even if Hillary Clinton wasn't their number one choice, they would like to see a candidate that is like Hillary Clinton, that they know well, that they've worked with in the past, that is very predictable. That is the type of president that for Jewish institutional organizations is the type of president that they can actually work with. And Donald Trump doesn't fit that ticket at all. So that's why when we talk about Jewish leaders, we don't seem to notice any kind of impact of the email stories or anything of that sort. Also, we need to keep in mind that these are people who have a relationship with Hillary Clinton for many years already. There's nothing really new about these stories. Nothing that can really shake their support for Hillary Clinton. It's very different than the general public, who has known Clinton, of course, for many years, but is only now getting exposed to these minute details of exactly what happened in terms of donations, in terms of emails, and so on. So really, I don't sense any kind of resonance for these stories among Jewish leaders or Jewish opinion makers.
Very interesting. We're going to come back to the Democrats in a moment, but you began talking about Trump. What you've told us so far is that even in Florida, he has, you said, about 25% of Jewish support, and he has much greater support in the Orthodox community. When you and I last spoke, you talked about Sheldon Adelson, and that Sheldon Adelson made the decision late, but he did make the decision to support Donald Trump. As far as you know, has anything changed with Adelson's support of Trump? And in general, is there Jewish money going to the Trump campaign?
Well, that's actually very interesting. Well, Jewish money is definitely going into the Trump campaign. Trump campaign's finance operation isn't really built in the traditional way that we've seen in previous elections. A lot of the money is coming from smaller donors, but definitely his campaign finance chair is Jewish American. His chief fundraiser is so definitely there is Jewish involvement in Trump's fundraising. However, he's facing difficulties in getting on board the traditional RJC type, the Republican Jewish Coalition board member type donors, who have usually been the foundation of any Republican presidential race. Most of them are either stating that they do not support Donald Trump, or basically staying out, and they prefer to put their money on congressional races this time around instead of giving money to Donald Trump. Sheldon Adelson, on the other hand, is different. He is an RJC board member and the group's biggest donor. And he came out with a statement of support for Donald Trump. And according to press reports, at least, which people have confirmed to me, people from the inner circle have confirmed to me, he was talking about giving up to $100 million to Donald Trump. And the interesting thing is that even though we're at the end of August now, the beginning of September, Labor Day is around the corner, at least according to federal filings, we haven't seen even $1 go from Sheldon Adelson to the Trump campaign, whether it's directly to the campaign or to the joint fundraising operation he has with the Republican National Committee. So definitely there is a question to ask of, is Sheldon Adelson still as supportive of Trump as he was? Will he actually live up to this $100 million sum, which is pretty significant? He still has time to give. The major investment in ad buys really only starts this month. So definitely he still has time to give a lot of money. But it just seems that it's unusual to wait so late with actually starting to write the checks. Anecdotally, we can note that Adelson does have a good relationship with Donald Trump. He hosted Trump at his suite during the Republican convention. According to a New York Times report, he had a meeting with him in which he urged Trump to be more humble. That was the report there. So definitely they have some kind of a dialogue, but at least based on the facts that we know right now, we don't know of any Adelson money actually going into the Trump campaign.
Nathan, how many presidential campaigns have you covered?
Well, I've been covering this pretty much since 2001, so this would be the third, fourth.
Okay. So you would have a sense, are you surprised that Adelson has not yet given Trump money in terms of public knowledge, public funding? And are you suggesting in a subtle way that Adelson may decide he doesn't want to fund Trump?
Well, I think what we're seeing with Adelson suggests that, like many other major donors, he feels some kind of sense of discomfort with Donald Trump. if you want to look back at previous elections, with Mitt Romney, it was easier. Mitt Romney and Sheldon Adelson had a pretty good dialogue. Of course, Adelson supported Newt Gingrich in the early stages of the
Right.
primaries, but later on switched very in a very smooth way. He switched to Mitt Romney. He had discussions with Mitt Romney. He got Mitt Romney to visit Israel to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And everything seemed to work very well, and that made it easier for him to give these large amounts of money to the campaign. With Trump, everything is more difficult. There was talk about a Trump visit to Israel. We haven't seen that yet. It is true that Trump clarified some of his earlier comments that made some supporters of Israel uneasy, talking about being neutral, not taking a stance about Jerusalem. He clarified that pretty well, but it's not the type of dialogue that major donors, major pro-Israel donors had with Republican candidates in the past. And that could be part of the reason that Sheldon Adelson is waiting on the sidelines or is being a little bit slow with actually living up to his pledge to support Trump with up to $100 million. That could be a reason.
There has been suggestion that Donald Trump, with his new campaign staff, is taking a different kind of approach, a softer approach, a gentler approach, an attempt to really project the fact that he is level-headed and is presidential and is capable of leading this country. Do you have any sense that Jews who so far have said to me, Republican Jews, have said to me they will not vote for Donald Trump and they won't vote for Hillary Clinton, but this, what was called in the media, a pivot. I'm not sure it was a pivot, but that's what it was called. Has that change in Trump over the last couple of weeks, do you think it can have a positive effect among Jewish Republicans?
I think potentially it could have that type of an effect, but I'd say there are two problems here. First of all, we're not really sure that we're seeing this pivot or this change of tone yet. Yes, the new Donald Trump sticks closer to the text when reading his speeches, and yes, he's trying to reframe and moderate his immigration stance and to appeal to broader audiences. That's for sure. But on the other hand, there are other voices in his campaign, and there is definitely some concern among Jewish supporters and many others in the Jewish community regarding the former affiliations of his new staff members, and especially when we look at people that were associated with the Breitbart news. So definitely it's not clear cut yet that Donald Trump has actually made this shift, and that it's now up to Jewish supporters to decide whether they reach the point of comfort with him that they can vote for him. The other thing is that it's kind of late in the race. Many of these people have already gone on record or made their personal decision not to vote for Donald Trump. They have many issues with him. And if he really wants to win back Jewish voters, and you can just look at the numbers of Jewish former security officials in the Bush administration, leaders of the community that have stated that they have serious issues with Donald Trump, it's really a little late in the game to convince them to reconsider their position. And Donald Trump will have to do more than just reading speeches from the teleprompter if he wants to do that in the very short time that's left.
By the way, you mentioned Breitbart. Breitbart, of course, has, it seems to me, a legitimately so, a very right-wing reputation. Some people have asked me whether it is also anti-Semitic. Has Breitbart ever been associated with anti-Semitism?
Well, that's a difficult question. I'd say that those who have looked into it closely have found things that they find to be disturbing published by Breitbart, whether it's the way they described William Crystal as the Jewish renegade, whether it's comments made on the website about a former Jewish staffer who had left and wasn't in good terms with the publication anymore. And whether it's just the simple fact that Breitbart News has become the home, the online home to the alt-right movement, and many people understand the alt-right movement as a modern-day iteration of the white supremacists, the KKK, and neo-Nazi movements. Now, of course, it's not all the alt-right, but it does host some of those voices. So I would say that in terms of Breitbart and anti-Semitism, many people who have looked into it feel uncomfortable. It's not one of those clear-cut questions where you can say, yes, that is an anti-Semitic website. That's sure not, but it does host views and ideas and people that have raised concern in the Jewish community.
Okay. You wrote a piece describing how Republicans hope that if they make a big deal of the $400 million the United States gave to Iran, and the question is, was it in some way a ransom for the release of Americans held hostage by Iran, that if Republicans make a big deal of that, perhaps they can encourage some people, some Jews, to vote for Trump instead of Clinton. Would you comment on your story, what prompted it, and how you see things now?
Right, and I think the main point was not necessarily convincing them to support Trump over Clinton, but actually targeting Senate races where Republicans are facing a tough race in states where there is a significant Jewish population that cares about these issues. And the hope of the Republicans is to raise this issue of the Iranian nuclear deal in a way that could sway Jewish voters or even pro-Israel voters who are not Jewish and ask questions about the conduct of the Democratic Senate candidates. And that could be helpful in certain swing states. We're talking about Pennsylvania, we're talking about Florida, we're talking about a few other Senate races. And the idea is to put these Democratic candidates on the spot on this specific issue of the $400 million, because frankly, the idea of turning the vote over the Iranian nuclear deal as a whole into a campaign issue hasn't really gotten much traction so far. But when you look at this specific issue, that's something that people can resonate. It's something that people can relate to, because you're talking about the United States, basically, according to these campaign ads, paying ransom to Iran in order to get the release of Americans who were held there. And that's something that rings as being very wrong to many voters. And the idea is to corner these Democratic candidates and get them to talk on record on that. Are you for this or against this? And it's very difficult for Democrats who supported the Iranian nuclear deal, who are very supportive of President Obama. They may not feel comfortable with this specific payment. Some of them have no problem with it, but some of them don't. But it's difficult for them to speak out against the party line. And that seems to be a tactic that could move, again, we're talking about the margins of the margins, but could move some voters in these senatorial races.
Very interesting. Speaking of congressional contests, we just saw that Debbie Wasserman Schultz won her primary election in Broward County, Florida. And of course, she had to resign her position as the head of the National Democratic Party. I'm not sure I got the formal name right, but she had to resign, and there was some question as to, what would happen to her now. And here she is, perhaps the most visible Jew in Congress. What's your sense of the fact that she won her primary, and what do you imagine her political future to be?
Well, it's interesting because just to say it mildly, she had an awful year, of course.
Yes.
She was basically forced to resign from her position as chair of the DNC on the eve of the Democratic convention, following the release of emails that proved the point that, to a certain extent, that Bernie Sanders and his supporters were trying to make, which was that under the leadership of Debbie Wasserman Schultz, the DNC was biased to a certain extent in favor of Clinton and against Sanders. And that, in a way, translated also into her congressional re-election race, into the Democratic primaries, where she was facing, for the first time, challenged for the first time in more than 20 years, she was facing a contender, Timkanova, who was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, who managed to raise a lot of money thanks to this endorsement, and money from supporters who felt that they were not only fighting for him against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but they were also fighting against the Democratic establishment. But at the end of the day, I think what we saw there when the primary elections actually took place on Tuesday was that voters in congressional districts vote according to their own interests and their district's interest.
Yes.
They're for sure aware of what's going on the national level,
Yes.
but it's not so much a Sanders against the establishment. It's the fact that they have a long-standing relationship with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. They feel that she represented them well in Congress for 6 terms already, and they like her. She has a good connection with her constituency, and that's what we saw playing out in the primary election. Question is, what happens next? Does she have any position waiting for her in terms of congressional leadership, in terms of cabinet positions if Hillary Clinton wins?
Yes.
And that will be a little more difficult now. At the time, people before this latest controversy, people spoke of her as a possible contender for Speaker of the House once Nancy Pelosi steps down, or a position like that. Now she's a little more toxic, and she will have to rebuild the support and overcome this sense that the Sanders people have managed to instill among many Democrats, which is that she represents the establishment. On the other hand, she could also maybe gain from the situation if Hillary Clinton feels that she has to compensate somehow Debbie Wasserman Schultz for standing up for her and for backing her during the primary.
Well, you mentioned Bernie Sanders in relationship to the Debbie Wasserman Schultz race. What do you think Jewish voters who supported Sanders in the primary are going to do? Has Sanders done enough to heal the breach between himself and Hillary Clinton that you now believe many of the Jews who supported Sanders with enormous enthusiasm, Nathan, are in fact now going to come back to Hillary?
I think they will. I think one of the interesting phenomena that we've seen is that even though Sanders mounted this significant challenge and this super effective campaign during the primaries, once it was over, it was over. And it was interesting even to look at polls, of course, not specifically regarding Jewish voters, but right after Sanders conceded, which was pretty late in the race, most of his supporters said right away that they will vote for Hillary Clinton. And I covered the Democratic convention in Philadelphia, and clearly there was a very vocal contingency there of Sanders supporters who will never vote for Hillary Clinton, and made their position clear. But when you actually look at the crowd and talk to people, you see that that was a very small vocal minority. The majority of Sanders supporters in general, Jewish and non-Jewish, feel comfortable in voting for Hillary Clinton now. And I would say, and that's a little bit of a speculation, but I think that Jewish voters especially are more likely to switch from Sanders to Clinton because they fear Donald Trump, because there is this notion that if they stay out of the race or don't vote at all, they might have a Trump presidency, and that is something that scares this type of Jewish voters.
Okay, Nathan, so the other question for you is, you also have an intimate knowledge of Israel. You're in contact with Israelis all the time. Do they seem to care what happens in the American election? And if they do, are they expressing any preference? We know that the rank and file, the cab drivers in Israel didn't seem to be big Obama fans. At the moment, is it your sense that Israelis would rather have Donald Trump simply because they don't want another Democrat? Or at the moment, do you feel that somehow they're prepared to embrace Hillary Clinton?
It's a complicated question. There are polls that have been conducted in Israel in the past month or two that indicate that Israelis would rather see Hillary Clinton win, but in relatively small margins. When they're asked who would be a better president, they say Hillary Clinton. When they're asked who would be a better president for Israel, it's pretty much even. And when they're asked who would get along better with Prime Minister Netanyahu, Donald Trump gets the majority. My sense is that Israelis, first of all, they're fascinated by this presidential race, as, by the way, is the rest of the world. It's an unusual contest, and everyone wants to know what will come out.
Yes.
And clearly, yes, as you said very accurately, Israelis did not like President Obama, mainly because of his troubled relations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. On the other hand, Hillary Clinton, even when she was Secretary of State, was appreciated in Israel as a professional Secretary of State. She wasn't seen as someone who has any specific issue with Israelis. Bill Clinton is still a tremendous brand in Israel. He was very liked as president, and Israelis still like Bill Clinton. So I would say, if we're looking at this man on the street question of who do you rather see, I'd say that people are split, because on the one hand, there's this instinct of saying, well, another Democrat would be another Obama, which would mean trouble for Israel. On the other hand, people are turned off by Trump and kind of like Hillary Clinton. So that's why we see this split. In terms of, if you look at elites, at political elites, at intellectual, they tend to prefer Hillary Clinton. And the reason is the same reason that you see in polling anywhere else around the world. Donald Trump is seen as someone who is not predictable, who doesn't have a track record of dealing with foreign affairs. And that's a cause of concern for people who care about the U.S.-Israeli relationship, mainly because all this is new for him, and he seems to be switching his positions way too often on most of these issues.
Nathan, it's always wonderful to talk to you and get your insight. You're such a superb reporter. By the way, Nathan, are you having fun with this election?
Actually, I'm having the time of my life. It's election coverage is always fun, but this one more than ever. It's providing us with a lot of news, a lot of good stories, and it is interesting to watch from up close.
Yes. Well, kol hakavod to you, and thank you so much for always making time for us here on JBS. We'll talk to you again as the election draws closer. In the meantime, have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. We'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The thoughts of Nathan Guttman, the Washington correspondent for the Jewish Forward. The election is so fascinating. By the way, it seems at the moment that Hillary Clinton has an insurmountable lead and momentum, but things change, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes in the next 2 months. This is our last in the news or election 2016 before Labor Day. Everyone here at JBS hopes you have a relaxing, warm, happy Labor Day weekend. You're ready to begin the new season after that. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, our editor, Dennis Golan, to JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of Election 2016, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.